Alien girl unleashes raging desire with human lust elixir epic. What would you do if a single sip of a strange elixir turned your body into a wildfire of unstoppable desire, pulling you toward the one person you've fought to resist? Today, I, your storyteller from the Sci-Fi Nebula channel, will transport you aboard the Nostromo Dawn, a world of cosmic battles, forbidden passion, and a serum that ignites chaos among the stars. Stick around until the very end, because the most shocking twists will leave you reeling. Before we dive into this sizzling saga, please hit that like button and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the rocket fuel powering our wildest tales. Got a cosmic story idea you're burning to hear? Drop it in the comments below, or just type 1 if this hooks you, or 0 if we need to turn up the heat. Now, let's blast off into the untamed expanse of the universe. Chapter 1, Under the Influence of Fire. The world swam into focus through a haze of pain, a throbbing ache that pulsed behind Zara Quill's luminous eyes. Her silver skin glistened with a sheen of sweat as she stirred on the cold metal slab of the Nostromo Dawn's medbay. Every nerve in her body screamed, alive with a heat that felt like molten starfire coursing through her veins. She groaned, pressing a trembling hand to her temple, and tried to piece together the fragments of memory that danced just beyond her grasp. The last thing she recalled was the victory celebration. An ambush by void-dwelling creatures had been repelled, and the crew of the intergalactic research vessel had gathered in the mess hall to toast their survival. Elias Shepard, the ship's human commander, had raised a glass of amber liquid he'd called Earth's finest gift. Zara, the only Zoryn among them, had joined in, her curiosity piqued by the unfamiliar drink. She downed it in one gulp, the burn pleasant at first, a sharp contrast to the sterile chill of deep space. But now something was terribly wrong. Her breath hitched as she forced her eyes open, the medbay's harsh white light stabbing into her sensitive retinas. Above her loomed Dr. Ellen Ripley, the ship's chief medical officer, her stern face softened by a flicker of concern. The older woman's gray-streaked hair was pulled back tightly, and her hands moved with practiced efficiency over a diagnostic scanner. "Zara, can you hear me?" Ripley's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a tension that set Zara's instincts on high alert. What happened?" Zara rasped, her throat dry as if she'd swallowed a mouthful of asteroid dust. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness crashed over her, forcing her back against the slab. Her body felt foreign, a traitor ignited by an insatiable need she couldn't name. Ripley's lips pressed into a thin line as she set the scanner aside. "You had a reaction to the liquor Shepard gave you. It wasn't just alcohol, it interacted with Project Erebus, the experimental serum in your system." Zara's heart stuttered. Project Erebus. She'd heard whispers of it, a classified human initiative to enhance endurance and strength for soldiers exploring the galaxy's uncharted fringes. All crew members had been dosed with it upon enlistment, a precaution against the unknown. But she wasn't human. She was Zoryn, her species a shimmering anomaly among the stars, with skin that gleamed like polished metal and eyes that glowed with the energy of captured emotions. Her biology was a delicate dance of differences, and now it had betrayed her. What kind of reaction, she demanded, though a sinking dread told her she already knew. The fire in her blood, the ache coiling low in her belly, it was too familiar, a shadow of the Zoryn mating cycles she'd endured in her youth. But this was different. Wilder. Uncontrollable. Ripley hesitated, her gaze darting away before returning with clinical detachment. In humans, Erebus boosts physical performance, strength, reflexes, stamina. In you, it's amplified your primal instincts. Your hormone levels are spiking off the charts. It's triggered an extreme state of arousal. The words hit Zara like a plasma bolt, searing through her defenses. Arousal. The shame of it burned hotter than the serum itself. She squeezed her glowing eyes shut, willing the world to disappear, but the sensation only intensified, a relentless tide pulling her under. She was a warrior, forged in the icy forges of her homeworld, Zorith Prime. She'd faced down void beasts and navigated asteroid storms without flinching. And now, felled by a single drink, she was reduced to this, a trembling wreck, her body a battlefield she couldn't conquer. "There has to be a way to stop it," she said, her voice cracking as she fought to keep it steady. "Tell me you can fix this." Ripley sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I've cross-referenced Zoryn physiology in the database. There's a sedative I can administer, it'll dull the edge, buy you some time. But the only way to fully relieve it," she trailed off, her expression softening with something dangerously close to pity. "You'd need to give in. Find someone willing to help you through it." Zara's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. The thought of exposing this weakness to her crew, humans who already viewed her as an outsider with her silver skin and third eye, was unbearable. On Zorith Prime, such a lapse would see her stripped of her rank, cast out in disgrace. She couldn't let that happen here, light years from home, surrounded by strangers who'd never understand. "I need to think," she said hoarsely, swinging her legs over the edge of the slab despite the dizziness. "Alone?" Ripley nodded, stepping back. "Take what time you need. Call me if it gets worse." She hesitated, then added, "Be careful, Zara. This isn't something you can fight forever." Zara didn't respond. She grabbed a thin medical gown, slipping it over her sweat-soaked undersuit, and stumbled out of the medbay. The ship's corridors stretched before her, a labyrinth of steel and shadow, and she moved quickly, keeping to the edges where the light was dim. Her glowing eyes darted around, praying she wouldn't encounter anyone. The Nostromo Dawn was a hive of activity even at rest, its crew a mix of scientists and soldiers, but luck, or perhaps the stars themselves, held. She reached her quarters without incident. The door hissed shut behind her, and Zara sagged against it, her chest heaving. The small room was a sanctuary, its sparse furnishings a stark contrast to the chaos raging within her. A narrow bunk, a desk littered with star charts, a single hollow image of Zorith Prime's twin moons glowing faintly in the corner, it was all she had to anchor herself. She stripped off the gown and collapsed onto the bunk, the cool sheets a fleeting relief against her feverish skin. But the reprieve was short-lived. Her hands moved of their own accord, tracing the contours of her body in a desperate bid to ease the ache. A whimper escaped her lips as her fingers brushed the sensitive curve of her neck, the taut plane of her abdomen. It was wrong, shameful. If her crew saw her like this, debased and undone, they'd never look at her the same. She was Zara Quill, the blade of Zorith, not some creature ruled by base instinct. Yet the need clawed at her, relentless, and she rocked against the mattress, chasing a release that refused to come. A sharp chime shattered the silence, the door. Zara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She held still, willing whoever it was to leave, but the chime sounded again, followed by a voice she'd know anywhere. "Zara? It's Elias. Ripley told me you weren't feeling well. I wanted to check on you." Elias Shepard. Her commander. Her friend. The last person she wanted to face in this state. His voice, usually a steady anchor in the chaos of their missions, now sent a fresh wave of heat crashing through her. She'd always admired him, the rugged lines of his face, the quiet strength in his dark eyes, but she'd buried those feelings deep, locked away behind duty and discipline. Now, with the Serum stripping her bare, they roared to the surface, raw and undeniable. She bit her lip, tasting the metallic tang of blood, and weighed her options. Send him away, claim exhaustion, and pray he'd believe her. Or open the door and risk everything. Her body trembled, torn between reason and desire, and the fire within her burned brighter, whispering a single, treacherous word, yes. Chapter 2, The Fire Spreads. Zara Quill stood trembling at the threshold of her quarters, her silver hand hovering over the door panel. Elias Shepard's voice lingered in the air, a tether pulling at the fraying edges of her resolve. She should send him away, every shred of her Zoryn discipline screamed it, but the fire raging in her veins drowned out reason. Before she could stop herself, she slammed the panel, and the door slid open with a hiss. Elias stood there, his broad frame filling the doorway, dark brows knitted with concern. His gray uniform was rumpled from the day's chaos, and his eyes, those steady, storm-cloud eyes, swept over her in an instant. He took in her disheveled state, the wild tangle of her silver hair, the thin undersuit clinging to her sweat-slicked skin, the faint glow of her third eye pulsing erratically on her forehead. His lips parted, a question forming, but Zara didn't give him the chance. She grabbed the front of his jacket, her fingers curling into the fabric with desperate strength, and yanked him inside. The door sealed shut behind him, locking them in the dim, humming silence of her cabin. Elias stumbled, catching himself against the wall, his breath hitching as he stared at her. "Zara, what?" he began, his voice rough with confusion, but she cut him off, stepping into his space with a fierceness she couldn't contain. "I need you," she panted, the words spilling out raw and unfiltered. "Now." His eyes widened, shock flashing across his rugged features. For a heartbeat, he was still, his mind racing to catch up with the scene unfolding before him. Zara knew how she must look, wild, unhinged, her glowing eyes blazing with a hunger she couldn't hide. She was a Zoryn warrior reduced to an animal in heat, and the shame of it clawed at her, but the serum's pull was stronger. If he turned her away now, she wasn't sure she could survive the rejection. But then something shifted in Elias's gaze. The shock melted into something deeper, speculative, then hungry. His eyes raked over her trembling form, her heaving chest, the taut lines of her body, the damp fabric clinging to her thighs, and when they met hers again, they were dark, pupils blown wide with desire. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, laced with a restraint that was already fraying. "I don't want to take advantage." "I've never been more sure," she said fiercely, closing the distance between them. Her hand slid up his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his uniform, the rapid thud of his heart matching her own. "Please, Elias." He cursed under his breath, a sharp, broken sound, and then his control snapped. Large hands seized her hips, dragging her flush against him, and Zara gasped as she felt the hard ridge of his arousal pressing into her belly. The sensation sent her head spinning, her knees weakening, and then his mouth was on hers, hot, demanding, and everything she hadn't dared to dream. She opened for him eagerly, her tongue tangling with his as her hands fisted in his short, dark hair. Elias kissed like he commanded, with single-minded focus and a ferocity that stole her breath. He walked them backward, guiding her through the cramped cabin until the edge of the bunk hit the backs of her thighs. She tumbled onto the mattress, pulling him down with her, and the weight of him settling over her was a balm to the fire consuming her. His lips scorched a path down her throat as his hands tore at her undersuit, peeling it away to bare her silver skin to his touch. Zara arched into him, a moan escaping her as he lavished attention on her sensitive flesh, stoking the inferno beneath her surface. She clung to his shoulders, her nails digging into his jacket, and rocked against him, chasing the relief she'd been denied for too long. "Gods, Zara," he groaned against her neck, his breath hot and ragged. "You're burning up. I've wanted you for so long." His words ignited something fierce within her, knowing he desired her, maybe as much as she'd secretly craved him, made her feel powerful despite her vulnerability. She tugged at his uniform, impatient, and he helped her strip it away, revealing the planes of his human body, scarred, strong, and achingly real. When he pressed himself between her thighs again, the friction was electric, and she cried out his name, lost to the storm of sensation. Time blurred into a haze of frenzied coupling, their bodies moving together in a rhythm as old as the stars. Elias matched her desperation with his own, his hands and mouth mapping every inch of her as if committing her to memory. When she shattered beneath him, it was with a force that left her trembling, his own release following moments later as he buried his face in her shoulder, shuddering against her. They collapsed in a tangle of limbs, sweat-slicked and breathless, and Elias pulled her close, pressing tender kisses to her damp forehead. Zara burrowed into his embrace, savoring the fleeting peace, but even as the afterglow warmed her, she felt the embers stirring again. The serum's grip hadn't loosened, it was insatiable, a beast coiled in her core, ready to strike anew. For days, they lost themselves in each other, the cabin a cocoon shielding them from the outside world. Elias rose to her every need, his stamina a testament to his own strength, but even he had limits. On the fourth morning, Zara woke to find him sprawled beside her, his chest rising and falling in the deep, exhausted sleep of a man pushed beyond endurance. She traced the lines of his face with her glowing eyes, a pang of guilt twisting in her gut. He'd given her everything, and still, the ache between her thighs pulsed, sharper now, edging into pain. She couldn't do this to him anymore. Slipping from the bunk, she pulled on a robe and padded barefoot through the Nostromo Dawn's quiet corridors, the hum of the ship's engines a steady heartbeat beneath her feet. The med bay doors slid open with a whisper, and Dr. Ripley looked up from her console, startled. "Zara," she said, taking in her wild hair and flushed skin. "You look." "I need help," Zara interrupted, her voice trembling with urgency. "It's not stopping. It's getting worse." Ripley's expression darkened as she gestured to a biobed. "Sit. Let me run some scans." Her hands moved quickly, but her silence was heavy, and when she finally spoke, her tone was grim. "The serum's mutated. It's not just affecting you anymore, it's contagious. Anyone you've been in close contact with could be infected." Zara's blood ran cold, her mind flashing to Elias, the hours they'd spent entwined, the heat of his skin against hers. Before she could process the horror, the medbay doors hissed open again, and Elias stumbled in, his eyes glazed, his face flushed with the same unnatural fever she'd felt. "Zara," he panted, his voice a growl of need. "I can't think. I need you, now." She backed away, her heart hammering as panic clawed at her throat. He advanced, his gaze predatory, and she saw the man she loved reduced to a shadow of himself, consumed by the same fire that had claimed her. This was her fault, she'd spread this curse to him. "Doctor," she snapped, her voice shaking but firm. "Sedate him." Ripley hesitated, a hypospray in hand. "I don't know how it'll react with the mutation." "Do it." Zara shouted, and Ripley moved, jabbing the device into Elias's neck. For a moment, he fought it, his eyes locked on hers with a desperate intensity. Then they rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Zara sank to her knees beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears stinging her glowing eyes. She stood, squaring her shoulders, and turned to Ripley. "Put me under. A medically induced coma. If I'm awake, I'm a danger to everyone." Ripley's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "If that's what you want." "It's what I need," Zara said, climbing onto the biobed. As the sedative hissed into her veins, she closed her eyes, praying to the stars that this nightmare would end, for her, for Elias, for them all. Chapter 3, In the Galactic Dark. Zara Quill drifted in a void of half-formed dreams, her consciousness unmoored from the relentless fire that had consumed her body. The medically induced coma wrapped her in a cold, numbing embrace, silencing the serum's roar but leaving her mind adrift among fragmented memories. She saw the silver spires of Zorith Prime piercing a violet sky, felt the weight of her warrior's blade in her hand, heard the low hum of the Nostromo Dawn's engines as she'd first stepped aboard, a stranger among humans. Time lost meaning in this liminal space, it could have been hours or centuries, and she wouldn't know the difference. Voices pierced the fog, disjointed and faint, like echoes bouncing off asteroid fields. "Mutating faster than I can track, half the crew now, no time left." A sharp sting in her arm jolted her back, dragging her upward through layers of oblivion. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy as lead, and the sterile glow of the medbay seeped into her vision. She blinked, her glowing eyes struggling to focus on the figure looming over her. "Zara, can you hear me?" Dr. Ellen Ripley's voice cut through the haze, sharp with exhaustion. Her face came into view, etched with lines of worry, her gray eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Zara's tongue felt thick, clumsy in her dry mouth. "What happened?" she croaked, forcing herself to sit up. Her muscles protested, weak and uncoordinated from disuse, and Ripley steadied her with a firm hand, propping pillows behind her back. "You've been out for 3 weeks," Ripley said, her tone heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "And things have gotten worse, much worse." 3 weeks. The word sank into Zara like a blade, cold and unyielding. She'd left Elias unconscious on the medbay floor, left the crew to fend for themselves while this nightmare spiraled out of control. Her silver hands clenched the edge of the biobed, the metal creaking under her grip. "How bad is it?" Ripley swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor before meeting Zara's again. "The mutated serum spread. More than half the crew is infected. They're not themselves. Driven by instinct, like animals. If we don't stop it soon, the Nostromo Dawn will be lost to chaos." A wave of guilt crashed over Zara, threatening to drown her. She'd been the spark, the careless Zoryn who'd ignited this plague with her own weakness. Elias, her crew, her friends, they were suffering because she hadn't fought harder, hadn't locked herself away sooner. Her glowing eyes dimmed, the light flickering with self-recrimination. "What about Elias?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ripley hesitated, and that pause spoke volumes. "He's alive. Sedated, for now. But he's changed. The serum didn't just amplify desire, it stripped away restraint. Exposed things he'd buried deep." Zara's chest tightened, a cold knot of dread forming in her gut. She needed to see him, to know he was still the man she trusted with her life, and her heart. But Ripley's words hinted at a fracture, a truth she wasn't ready to face. She pushed it aside, steeling herself. "What do we do? There has to be a way to fix this." Ripley held up a syringe, its contents a viscous, shimmering green, Project Erebus in its original form, before the mutation had twisted it into a monster. "This is our last shot," she said. "I've been analyzing your blood samples, Zara. The mutation bonded with your Zoryn physiology in ways I couldn't predict. But if I introduce the untainted serum into your system, it might reset the process, revert it to its intended purpose." Zara stared at the syringe, her glowing eyes tracing the liquid's faint luminescence. More of the stuff that had started this nightmare. The irony wasn't lost on her, and a bitter laugh bubbled up in her throat, dying before it reached her lips. "You want to pump me full of the same poison that broke me?" "I know it's a risk," Ripley admitted, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "But if it works, we can synthesize more and treat the others. It's our only hope." Zara closed her eyes, gathering the shards of her resolve. She'd faced death in the void, stared down creatures with claws like scythes, and survived. She could face this too, for Elias, for the crew, for the chance to make things right. She thrust out her arm, baring the inside of her elbow. "Do it." Ripley nodded, her expression solemn as she slid the needle into Zara's vein. The serum burned as it entered her bloodstream, a searing fusion of ice and fire that made her gasp. Her back arched off the bed, her silver skin shimmering with a sudden, violent glow as the all-consuming lust roared back to life. It clawed at her, a beast unleashed, and she gripped the biobe's edges, her nails leaving dents in the metal. For a terrifying moment, she thought it had failed, that she'd be lost to the madness again. But then, blessedly, the tide receded. The unnatural need ebbed away, leaving behind a lingering warmth and a deep, bone-weary relaxation. Zara sagged against the pillows, tears of relief pricking at her glowing eyes as her breathing steadied. She felt, herself again, the fire reduced to embers she could control. "Well?" Ripley asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "How do you feel?" "Normal," Zara said, the word a wonder on her tongue. A shaky laugh escaped her, tinged with hysteria. "I feel normal. I can't believe it worked." Ripley's face split into a rare, wide grin. "Excellent. I'll start synthesizing more immediately." If we move fast, we can have the crew back to themselves by shift's end. Zara swung her legs over the side of the biobed, testing her strength. Her muscles trembled but held, and a surge of determination steadied her. I need to see Elias, she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion weighing her down. I need to tell him I'm sorry, to make sure he's okay. Ripley caught her arm as she stood, her grip gentle but insistent. Zara, wait. There's something you should know first. The doctor's tone sent a chill down Zara's spine, the knot of dread tightening. What is it? Ripley took a deep breath, choosing her words with care. The serum didn't just affect libido. It lowered inhibitions completely, brought buried desires to the surface, unchecked. T'Pol Saren, our Vulcan science officer, she's had feelings for Elias for a long time. Under the mutation's influence, she acted on them. The world tilted around Zara, the medbay's sterile walls blurring as the implications sank in. T'Pol Saren, quiet, reserved, her Vulcan logic a stark contrast to Zara's fiery Zoryn spirit, had been with Elias. Had touched him, claimed him, in a way Zara had thought was hers alone. Her glowing eyes flickered, the light dimming as a hollow ache bloomed in her chest. I see, she said woodenly, the words tasting of ash. Thank you for telling me. Ripley reached for her, sympathy softening her stern features. Zara, But Zara shook her off, unwilling to be comforted. She felt numb, carved out by a betrayal she couldn't fully blame on either of them. Elias hadn't been himself, T'Pol hadn't either. The serum had stripped them bare, turned their deepest impulses into weapons. Yet the knowledge that Elias had given himself to another, even under duress, cut deeper than any void beast's claw. I need to get back to the ship, she said stiffly, straightening her spine. The crew needs me. She turned on her heel and marched out of the medbay, her silver skin catching the light like armor. Her head was high, her glowing eyes fixed ahead, but inside, her heart cracked with every step. She was a warrior, a survivor, she wouldn't break, not where anyone could see. But as she strode through the Nostromo Dawn's corridors, the stars outside the viewport seemed colder, their light a mocking echo of the fire she'd just escaped. Chapter 4, Fractures Beneath the Stars. Zara Quill moved through the Nostromo Dawn's corridors like a specter, her silver skin reflecting the dim glow of the ship's lights. The hum of the engines vibrated beneath her feet, a steady pulse that mocked the chaos churning within her. She'd left the medbay with her head held high, her glowing eyes fixed forward, but each step toward Elias Shepard's quarters felt like wading through a gravity well, every inch a struggle against the weight of what she'd learned. T'Pol Saren had been with him. The serum had stripped away their control, yes, but the truth of it gnawed at her. Some part of Elias had wanted the Vulcan, even if he'd never acted on it before. She stopped outside his cabin, her hand hovering over the door chime. The silence pressed against her, heavy and expectant, and for a moment, she considered turning back. She could bury this pain, lock it away with the discipline of a Zoryn warrior, and focus on the crew's recovery. But she needed to see him, to look into his eyes and know if the man she loved was still there, beneath the scars of this nightmare. Taking a shaky breath, she pressed the chime. Come in, Elias's voice called, weary and rough, like a man who'd fought a war and lost. The door slid open, revealing a dimly lit room that mirrored her own in its sparseness, a bunk, a desk, a viewport framing the endless stars. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, his head cradled in his hands, his dark hair disheveled. He looked up as she entered, and the raw relief that flooded his face nearly undid her. His eyes were bloodshot, shadowed with exhaustion, and his broad shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. Zara, he breathed, rising to his feet with a stumble. You're okay. I'm okay, she confirmed, her voice softer than she'd intended. Ripley found a cure. He closed his eyes briefly, a shudder running through him. Thank the stars. But when he opened them again, guilt darkened his gaze, and he took a step toward her, hands outstretched. Zara, I'm so sorry. What I did, what I let happen. It wasn't your fault, she said, cutting him off. She wanted to believe it, needed to, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She crossed the room to him, drawn by an instinct she couldn't deny, and took his face in her silver hands. His skin was warm beneath her touch, rough with stubble, and she searched his eyes for the man she trusted with her life. "You weren't in control." "But I should have been," he said harshly, his voice cracking with self-recrimination. "I'm the commander. It's my job to keep it together, no matter what. And I failed. I failed the crew, and I failed you." The anguish in his tone pierced her, a blade slipping between her ribs. She saw the weight he carried, the responsibility he'd shouldered through every mission, every loss, and it mirrored her own. They were both warriors, bound by duty, and now broken by something neither could have foreseen. "You were infected," she said, her thumbs tracing the lines of his jaw. "The serum took your will. What happened with T'Pol? It wasn't you." His breath hitched, and he searched her face, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But it was me, Zara. Some part of me wanted her, even if I'd never have acted on it sober. How can you forgive that?" The question hung between them, heavy and sharp, and Zara's heart clenched. She wasn't sure she could, not fully. The image of Elias with T'Pol, their bodies entwined in a moment stolen by the serum, burned behind her eyes. It didn't matter that he hadn't chosen it, the knowledge that a piece of him had desired another cut deeper than she'd expected. But as she looked into his tortured gaze, saw the guilt eating him alive, she knew she had to try, for his sake, for hers, for whatever they still had left. "I forgive you," she said firmly, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "I forgive you because I love you, Elias. And I know you love me. What happened, it doesn't change that." His breath caught, a sob breaking free as he pulled her into a fierce embrace. His arms wrapped around her, clutching her tightly, and she felt the tremor in his frame, the desperation in his grip. She held him back, her silver hands splayed across his back, and they stood there, clinging to each other as the storm of emotions raged silently around them. His warmth seeped into her, grounding her, and for a moment, the pain receded, replaced by the solid reality of his presence. When they finally pulled apart, Elias wiped at his eyes, a tentative smile tugging at his lips. "Together," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "We'll get through this together." "Together," she agreed, squeezing his hand. But even as she spoke, a shadow lingered in her chest, a fracture she couldn't yet name. The moment shattered as the door chimed again. They exchanged a glance, and Elias called, "Come in." Dr. Ripley stepped inside, her stern face alight with triumph. "I did it," she announced, holding up a data pad. "We've synthesized enough of the original serum to treat the entire crew. Distribution's underway now." Relief crashed over Zara like a tidal wave, washing away some of the tension coiled in her gut. "That's incredible, Ellen," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, for everything." Ripley waved off the praise with a gruff shrug. "Just doing my job, Shepard. But I couldn't have done it without Zara. Her willingness to risk herself, it saved us all." Zara ducked her head, a flush rising to her silver cheeks. "I did what I had to," she muttered, uncomfortable under the weight of their gratitude. Elias took her hand, lacing their fingers together, and the warmth of his touch steadied her. "You were incredible," he said softly, his dark eyes shining with pride. "I'm so damn proud of you." Her throat tightened, a lump forming as she squeezed his hand back. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. "Knowing you were out here, waiting for me, it kept me fighting." He brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her knuckles. "I'll always need you, Zara. Always." Ripley cleared her throat, shifting awkwardly. "I'll, leave you two alone. Need to oversee the treatments." She backed toward the door, offering a rare, small smile before it slid shut behind her. Alone again, Elias drew Zara close, his forehead resting against hers. "I know we've got a lot to work through," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. But you're it for me, Zara. You're my forever. Tears pricked at her glowing eyes, and she tilted her face up, brushing her lips against his in a tender, tentative kiss. You're my forever too, she said, her voice trembling with the truth of it. No matter what. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the stars outside the viewport casting a soft glow over them. The Nostromo Dawn hummed around them, its crew slowly waking from the Serum's grip, and for the first time in weeks, Zara felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be rough, trust had been shaken, wounds carved deep, but they'd face it side by side. She leaned into Elias, her silver skin pressed against his warmth, and let herself believe they could heal. Outside, the galaxy stretched on, infinite and unforgiving, but in that moment, they were enough. Chapter 5, Fire Reborn. The Nostromo Dawn sailed through the void, its hull cutting a silent path among the stars. In the days following the Serum's cure, life aboard the ship began to stitch itself back together, thread by fragile thread. The crew moved through their shifts with a quiet determination, their faces marked by the shadows of what they'd endured. There were awkward glances, hushed apologies, and moments of averted eyes as memories of uninhibited actions surfaced like ghosts. But beneath it all ran a current of resilience, a shared strength forged in the crucible of chaos. They'd faced the abyss together and emerged, if not unscathed, then unbroken. For Zara Quill and Elias Shepard, the journey to recovery was a slower, more tender thing. The medbay's sterile walls faded into the background as they returned to their duties, but the echoes of the past weeks lingered in every touch, every glance. Zara stood at her post on the bridge, her silver fingers dancing over the navigation console, her glowing eyes fixed on the starfield beyond. Elias was beside her, his voice steady as he issued commands, but she felt the weight of his presence more keenly now, a tether she both craved and questioned. The first night after the cure, they'd sat in his quarters, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. She'd traced the scars on his hands, marks of battles fought long before the Serum, and he'd watched her with a quiet intensity, as if afraid she'd vanish. I don't know how to fix this, he'd admitted, his voice raw. But I want to try. For us. She'd nodded, her glowing eyes dim with exhaustion. So do I, she'd whispered, and they'd begun, step by halting step, to rebuild what the Serum had shaken. Long, honest conversations stretched into the early hours, their voices weaving a tapestry of confession and understanding. They spoke of fear, of guilt, of the love that had anchored them through the storm. Elias told her of the shame that gnawed at him, the betrayal he hadn't meant to inflict. Zara shared the ache of T'Pol's shadow, the wound that still bled when she let her guard down. Through it all, they found their bond shifting, deepening in ways neither had anticipated. The crisis had been a brutal catalyst, stripping away pretense and forcing them to confront what they truly wanted. And what they wanted, they discovered, was each other, not as commander and lieutenant, but as equals, partners in every sense. It wasn't easy. Trust, once fractured, didn't mend overnight. There were moments of doubt, of distance, when Zara's glowing eyes would flicker with uncertainty or Elias's jaw would tighten with unspoken regret. But they faced it with the same tenacity they brought to every mission, their hands clasped in the quiet spaces between shifts. One evening, as the ship orbited a crimson nebula, Zara found herself in the science bay. T'Pol's Zoryn stood at a console, her Vulcan features serene as she analyzed data from the cure's distribution. The air between them was taut, a thread pulled tight, and Zara hesitated, her silver skin catching the light. She could walk away, let the silence hold, but something in her, a Zoryn instinct for resolution, pushed her forward. T'Pol, she said, her voice steady but soft. The Vulcan turned, her dark eyes meeting Zara's glowing ones. For a moment, neither spoke, the hum of the ship filling the space. Then T'Pol inclined her head, a faint crease forming between her brows. Zara. I owe you an explanation. You don't, Zara said, raising a hand. I know what the Serum did. To all of us. T'Pol's composure faltered, a rare crack in her Vulcan mask. Nevertheless, I regret my actions. I did not intend to cause you pain. My feelings for Elias were, illogical, buried. The serum brought them forth, but that does not excuse the outcome. Zara studied her, the sharp lines of her face, the quiet dignity in her stance. She'd hated T'Pol in those first raw moments of discovery, a visceral Zoryn rage that had burned hot and bright. But now, standing here, she saw only another soul caught in the same tempest. I don't blame you, she said finally, the words a release she hadn't known she needed. We were all lost. Let's leave it there. T'Pol nodded, a flicker of gratitude softening her gaze. Thank you, Zara. For your understanding. Zara turned away, a weight lifting from her chest as she stepped back into the corridor. It wasn't forgiveness in the human sense, Zoryn hearts didn't bend so easily, but it was a letting go, a choice to move forward. She found Elias waiting for her on the bridge, his dark eyes catching hers as she approached. He didn't ask about T'Pol, he didn't need to. The way he reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers, said he understood. Later, in the quiet of his quarters, they stood before the viewport, the nebula's red glow painting their faces in hues of fire. Elias pulled her close, his arms a steady anchor, and she leaned into him, her silver skin pressed against his warmth. We're stronger now, he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. Because of this. She tilted her face up, meeting his gaze. Stronger, she agreed, and when their lips met, it was a reaffirmation, a promise sealed in the starlight. The kiss was slow, tender, a balm to the wounds they'd carried. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, breathing him in, and felt the last embers of doubt flicker out. The Nostromo Dawn pressed on, its crew a united front against the galaxy's unknowns. There were still challenges ahead, uncharted systems, hostile forces, the ever-present specter of the unexpected. But Zara and Elias faced them hand in hand, their bond a beacon in the dark. She traced the lines of his face with her glowing eyes, memorizing the man who'd become her forever, and he smiled, a rare, unguarded curve of his lips that lit her from within. You and me, he said, his voice a low rumble. Side by side, ready to take on the universe. She grinned, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The universe won't know what hit it. They stepped out of his quarters together, the corridor stretching before them like a path unwritten. The stars blazed outside, infinite and untamed, but within the ship's steel heart, something beautiful had taken root, a love tempered by fire, resilient as the hull that carried them. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't without scars. But it was theirs, built on trust reborn, and it would carry them through whatever lay beyond the next horizon. As the Nostromo Dawn sailed deeper into the galaxy, its crew stood ready, united, unbreakable, a testament to the strength found in surviving the worst together. For Zara and Elias, the journey was just beginning, a new chapter written in the light of stars and the quiet certainty of each other. The fire that had nearly consumed them had forged something stronger, and beneath its glow, they were unstoppable. And so, we've blazed through the epic tale of an alien girl unleashing raging desire with a human lust elixir, from Zara Quill's fiery descent into primal need aboard the Nostromo Dawn, through her torrid entanglement with Elias Shepard, to a crew gripped by chaos and a love reborn from the ashes of betrayal. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to help us hit 1,000 subs as fast as possible. Your passion keeps the Sci-Fi Nebula channel glowing with thrilling stories like this. See you in the next interstellar adventure.